I'm Shahar Azani, and welcome to this special episode of Eye on Israel. Israel's relationship with the United Nations has been an ongoing saga since the UN's resolution supporting the re-establishment of the Jewish state of Israel to the 1975 UN resolution comparing Zionism with racism, one which was famously torn on stage by Israel's UN ambassador at the time, the late Chaim Herzog. The UN General Assembly in New York, and not just there, has become a battleground for Israel. Dozens of anti-Israel resolutions, reports, and biased missions have been keeping Israel's diplomats busy for many years. Our special guest today on Eye on Israel will provide us with a peek behind the curtain at what's really going on in the hallways of the famous building on First Avenue in Manhattan. Ambassador Danon served as Israel's 17th permanent representative to the United Nations for 5 years, beginning in October of 2015. He currently holds the post of chairman of the World Likud. Danon was a member of the Knesset from February 2009 to August 2015. He has held the roles of Knesset Deputy Speaker, Deputy Minister of Defense, Minister of Science, Technology and Space, and Chair of the Committee of Immigration, Absorption and Diaspora Affairs. Danon is with us to discuss his latest book, In the Lion's Den, what an appropriate name, detailing diplomatic warfare, behind-the-scenes hostilities, and unexpected camaraderie in the halls of the United Nations. Ambassador, such a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for coming on JBS.
Thank you for having me, Shahar. I'm excited to share with you interesting stories from my new book.
So first of all, let me ask you this. How did you feel at the first moment when you accepted the position of Israel's ambassador to the United Nations?
When the former Prime Minister Netanyahu offered me the position, I told him that I'm taking it, but I have one phone call to make to my wife because, we had to relocate our family. We have 3 children. They were very young at the time to relocate them. And my wife told me she would be excited, to join me in that adventure. And immediately I told the Prime Minister, let's do it. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity I received to serve Israel in this very important position for 5 very, very long years.
And successful years, as I can say so myself. I want to ask you, Ambassador, that wasn't the first time you represented Israel here in the United States. For in your history, you used to be a shaliach, weren't you?
Well, for the last 30 years, I'm dealing with explaining Israel's position, dealing with our Asbara, the PR for Israel. I was an emissary of the Jewish Agency in South Florida for 3 years. And always, when I was in the Knesset, the government, I always, enjoyed fighting for the truth. That's my mission in life.
Right.
And when I got the opportunity to do it in a very respectful place like the UN, I grabbed the offer.
I just think about that moment from when you began, that moment in South Florida when you were with the Jewish Agency, and here you are at that in international stage representing not just Israel in many ways, but the Jewish people in the eyes of the entire world. We all have certain perspectives about the UN before, and then here you come in as ambassador after. What was your perspective before, and what changed, if any? Were your beliefs reinforced when you entered the UN, or did you find something that you were surprised to discover?
So I was very surprised to see the gap between the public UN and the private UN. I knew that there would be hostility, but what I actually found out that behind the scenes, behind closed doors, we have a lot of friends. People support Israel. They even admire Israel, Shahar. And for me, it was a great, great surprise. So one of the things I decided to change is to close that gap between what they actually say about Israel publicly. Usually they condemn us, they support ridiculous resolutions, but what they really think about us privately. And I think I was very successful in closing that gap. Today we have more public support. We can speak about the Abraham Accord that I was involved in behind the scenes to get to the position of signing the agreements. We can speak about moving embassies to Jerusalem, the US Embassy, Guatemala, Honduras. So I think we have to continue and convince our friends it's not enough to support us quietly. It's not enough to have strong bilateral relations. We want you to publicly stand with us, even in a hostile place like the UN.
And the truth is, you were never shy about your positions. You weren't cozying up to anybody else's position. Your truth has always been very strong and vocal.
And in the book, I tell the story, when the French ambassador in the middle of the Security Council came up with a ridiculous idea to send international observers to Jerusalem after we had riots on Temple Mount, I told him why we should not send them to the streets of France,
right.
Because you have riots. Back then they had riots from they called them the yellow vests.
Right.
And I told them, let's send the inspectors to France first, and then we can discuss if we want to send them to Jerusalem. But I think that approach to react immediately, sharply, I think it's the winning way to handle the UN.
There is, being a diplomat is not just a political issue, it's not just a grand issue of states, it's also a very personal issue. And, you infuse your personal traits into the conversations, your ability to make friends, and that was quite evident and visible during your term at the United Nations. So I want to ask you, there was that moment when Samantha Power and the United States refrained from exercising their veto right at the United Nations. And what I remember from that moment is the ovation, almost standing ovation by cold diplomats who were cheering on. That almost never happens in those diplomatic circles. What was your perspective? How did you react, and what was your feeling from the inside, within the Lion's Den?
So that was, Shahar, the hardest moment in my public life. Sitting there when usually we are used to fight the Palestinians, our adversaries, but here I was actually fighting our closest ally, the US. And everybody, unfortunately, supported the position of the US. I was by myself in the Lion's Den, but I had the inner strength to look at the eyes of the ambassadors and to tell them that we will prevail. The Jewish people is stronger than any UN resolution, and that's exactly what happened. But for me, it was very hard because, I was trying to get a response from Ambassador Power before the vote. And Prime Minister Netanyahu was trying to get a hold of President Obama. And we couldn't get any answer. It was a bad sign from the beginning. And immediately, I decided to expose the cowardly behavior of the US at that moment, because I would expect them to tell us exactly what they want to do and why they are doing it.
Right. You lead me to the next question, which is, as ambassador, you stood at the axis in between the disagreements, in the heart of the disagreements between the Netanyahu administration in Israel and the Obama administration. How did you navigate those stormy waters?
So I think one of the surprising details I describe in the book is that actually we collaborated with both administrations, with Obama's and Trump's administration. And we did it quietly. It was different. With Trump, it was much easier. Ambassador Nikki Haley, she's a great friend of Israel. We didn't have to explain her or ask for her support. She was there for us 24/7, and we appreciate that. With President Obama, it was more difficult. But, overall, we were able to explain our position. But the main issue that we see today is still relevant, unfortunately, is the Iran deal. Back in 2015, we were against the agreement. And today, 2022, we are still against the JCPOA. And we hope that the new administration will not sign this deal again.
You were mentioning Nikki Haley, and Ambassador Haley also wrote the foreword to your book. Describe your relationship with her, because she talks about you as an intimate friend, from the Shabbat dinner you had with them, talking about Israel, to the trips to Israel. Tell us the secrets of how to be such a successful interpersonal diplomat and not, the cold-hearted bureaucrat that some people have in mind. What did you do?
Well, I think you have to expose yourself, bring your family, invite people to your house. That's what we did with many ambassadors for Shabbat dinners. Be honest with them. And, when I offered Ambassador Haley to come to Israel, she told me whenever you want. And that was her first visit, Shahar. Since then, she came many times. But I remember the first time she walked in the old city of Jerusalem, the first time she met, Israelis, she was really excited about it. And I think if you are sincere, if you open yourself to others, you can achieve a lot. And I'm very grateful for the friendship. I'm sure she will be in very important positions in the future, and she will always remember what she learned, what she saw during her time in Israel.
Speaking with you, you can already sense it. I can only imagine that Shabbat dinner when she spoke not just with Ambassador Danny Danon, but with Danny Danon and Tali and the kids, and getting a first-hand impression of what it means to be an Israeli and a Jew, especially in a city like New York. I want to just tap this question for a minute. How was this experience for Tali and the kids? How was it for the family? Because you're at the forefront, you're a very public figure, but you also have the stamina to do it. You've done it all your life, just like you said. What was this experience like for them?
So I have to admit that at the beginning, it's not easy. My youngest daughter, Shira, when we left, she was 9 years old. And she told me, well, you got the position, so you should go. Why should I leave my friends, my school, the community where we live? And we had to convince her that, she had no choice. She had to come with us.
Right.
And also coming back after 5 years, it's also a challenge. But I think, we worked together. It was a teamwork. My wife was very involved with hosting many events in our residence, in creating activities outside of the UN, whether it's inviting ambassadors to Broadway shows or to other pro-Israel gatherings, to march with them in the streets of New York. And I think when you have the family with you, it's actually multiple your ability to be effective.
I personally remember one such interesting incident when you insisted, the permanent exhibit outside the UN Security Council that has the Palestinian narrative, and then you insisted on putting in the Israeli matters display to showcase the history of Israel and the beauty of Israel, and the UN did not give you an easy time on that issue, did they?
Absolutely not. And, the book is also a great tool for any pro-Israel activist. And I know that our audience, they love Israel, they stand with Israel. So I give a lot of my personal tips about how to counter BDS, how to counter anti-Semitism. And one of the things I speak about is zero tolerance. Don't sit idly by and say, what, I don't care. You fight for everything. And we had to fight the UN many times about the exhibition you described, about the reports they put against Israel. And I think we prove that we can win. We can win against the bureaucracy of the UN. And I think any student, any pro-Israel activist who is watching us now should learn the lesson that, it's not easy, but it's a mistake to ignore hate and anti-Israel activities.
Right, and what you famously taught is don't shy away from the challenge, be strong with your truth. I specifically remember with the exhibit when the United Nations did not want to put up the Zionism banner because they felt that the term Zionism was controversial, and instead of you trying to work it out diplomatically behind closed doors and curtains, you completely lit the entire city of New York, media and elected officials to say, if you don't recognize Zionism, you deny the Jewish people's right for self-determination. And the UN backed down after only a few hours. I'll never forget that moment. That's a great lesson, Ambassador.
It is. And I also told the story, Shahar, when I actually initiated the event of the reenactment at the Queen's Museum.
Correct.
When we celebrated 70 years for the historic decision to establish a Jewish state. And actually, the director of the museum,
right,
she tried to push us out and told us we could not have the event in the museum. And you are a former diplomat, and I wasn't diplomatic when I spoke to her, and I told her, listen, lady, you will be out of the museum, not us. And that's exactly what happened. We had a beautiful event with Vice President Pence and dozens of dignitaries, and that lady was kicked out of the museum when she tried to apply BDS against us.
That was actually one of the most memorable and incredible events that had been held. Absolutely correct, Ambassador. I remember I was there. I also want to tell you, we're used to looking at the halls of the UN as the great gladiator stage of the anti-Semitism, anti-Israel bias, and BDS. And you did something unlike any other. You actually used the same stage of the United Nations to counter BDS.
Yeah, that's exactly. I don't know if you actually practice judo or jiu-jitsu or karate. Right. I never did, but you actually use the strength of your enemy to win, and that's what we did at the UN. We took the General Assembly and we gathered thousands of pro-Israel activists. Some of my colleagues in the Jewish community, they told me, Danny, why you are doing it? The next week, the Palestinians will do another event against Israel in the General Assembly. And I told them they are doing it anyway every week. So why should we be afraid of that? And that's what we did. We gathered thousands of pro-Israel activists, we empowered students, and we showed the world that we are not afraid.
And you share all of these stories in your book, In the Lion's Den, which is really a very easy, wonderful, and practical read for anybody who wishes to understand how to represent Israel and the Jewish people with strength and conviction. I want to ask you on a personal level, what would you say was your toughest moment at the UN or your biggest disappointment? And what are you, and I know there are many things you're proud of, but what is one thing that you're mostly proud of during your term?
So I think we covered the hardest moment. That was December 2016,
right,
when the resolution 2334 passed, and I was sitting by myself there against everybody. It wasn't easy for me. I will always remember that moment. But we had great victories. And for me, the great victory was when I was elected to become the chairman of the legal committee of the United Nations. I became the first Israeli ever to chair a committee at the UN. It was a great success. It was not an easy campaign. Many of our adversaries campaigned against me. But when we counted the votes, I received the support of 109 member states compared to 44 who voted against me. So, and I proved to the world and to my friends in Israel back home that we are a member state in the UN. We can get elected to any position. And I think from now on, the sky is the limit for Israel at the UN.
Listen to that sentence, Danny. I just want to focus. The sky's the limit. You're not one to despair, even in one of the most hostile arenas for Israel. Many a time you hear people say, shmoom, what have we got to do there? It's futile, it's worthless. You proved otherwise, Danny.
And I'm very optimistic. I think we should continue only forward. I think we should increase our support to developing countries. And I address that issue in the book. We all believe in Tikkun Olam. Today we are a strong nation. We have a strong economy. We have great technology and innovation. We should help smaller countries, developing countries. And I speak about friendships. Our friends from the Pacific Islands, for example, Shahar, they were standing with us against all the hostility at the UN. So we shouldn't take it for granted. And if we continue to do that and support our friends, I think we will be able to win even greater victories at the UN.
You're talking about that side of Israel that so many people don't know of, and yet you promoted vehemently at the UN with resolutions and partnerships. And I was privileged to see with my own eyes when I served at the Israeli embassy in Nairobi, Kenya, the tremendous respect that many countries around the world have for Israel. And yet we have moments of great disappointment and despair. For instance, when we see, again, even now, the United Nations Human Rights Council initial report on last year's operation, which is a complete bias and sham. What's your message to the UN Human Rights Council, and what's your response for this report?
Shame on them. I think it's not the first time, it's not the last time. Instead of dealing with real human rights violations, they focus only on Israel. And I think the allies of Israel should consider whether to support those organs of the UN. We should support them financially. Should they stay active on those organs? My personal position is that if you cannot change and you cannot affect the result, you shouldn't stay there and give them any legitimacy. The book itself, like you said, is very practical. So if you want to understand what it's like to be an Israeli ambassador in the United Nations, you should read this for sure. But also, if you're about to be appointed to be Israel's permanent representative to the UN, so what would you say would be your main 2-3 pieces of advice for Israel's future permanent representative at the UN, and anybody for that matter who represents Israel on the global stage? What's your key secret for success? Well, I thank you for the compliment, and I'm sure that every diplomat, will enjoy reading the book because it's very similar, the challenges we are facing at the UN, also to other destinations. My main message to anyone who is representing and fighting for Israel is to reach out to everybody. You never know who will be there for you, and that's what I did even at the UN with UN officials. People always think about the role of the UN ambassador is dealing with colleagues from different countries. But we also deal with a lot of leaders that actually work at the UN. This building on First Avenue, you have thousands of employees, hundreds of departments. So I made friends with many of them, and it was very helpful to help Israelis to assume important positions at the UN, to help Israeli companies to sell their products to the UN. So I think the main message is to reach out, to be friendly. You never know when you will need those new friends.
I'm hearing a lot of also political pieces of advice here, because you are a people's person, and it's quite evident when you walk around in Israel, the friendship that you exude towards people, the recognition that you give out, and that was the fact that it was so evident and also very practical in the halls of the UN is a great message. So give us one such example. You were mentioning the work that you did behind the curtain, promoting what became the Abraham Accords. Give us a glimpse into that. Give us an example of such interactions that you've had at the UN with Arab ambassadors or others to take that step forward.
So, I worked very closely with many moderate countries, fighting radical voices at the UN, and that was before the Abraham Accords. I describe in the book an incident. I used to have those meetings in different locations in the city because they were very scared to be seen with me publicly. And in one of the meetings I was having with the ambassador from the UAE, it was supposed to be in a hotel room in Manhattan. And when I walked to the lobby of the hotel, I saw a lot of media reps standing there with cameras. And I was sure they were waiting for me or for the ambassador from the UAE. Right. And when I was texting her that I cannot go up to the room because somebody probably tipped the media. And then all of a sudden, Kim Kardashian walked out of the elevator and all the reporters actually chased her and ignored me completely. But, it was very funny, Shahar, that we had to do all those things, very secretly. And when I flew to the UAE in 2016, it was also a big operation to make sure nobody will know that I'm flying there. Even, I couldn't tell my kids. So I didn't lie to them because I told them I'm flying to Europe, right, which was true because I had a connection flight in Europe. Right. But we kept everything very secret. And today we have 14 flights a week between Tel Aviv and Dubai. You see thousands of visitors every day. And it's exciting to see what we achieved together.
Danny, as the former UN ambassador and now the head of World Likud, do you miss your old job? What do you do now that continues to maintain that connection between Israel and the world, something that you do so well?
So I'm still involved in diplomacy in different capacities. A few weeks ago, I led a delegation of ministers that we flew with them to see the Abraham Accords. We flew to the UAE, to Bahrain, and then to Israel. And we actually showed leaders from around the world that Israel and the Arab world is not a source of a problem, but actually can help them. So I'm very involved in actually learning and exploring the possibilities of what is the next stage of the Abraham Accords, not only supporting our nations, but supporting other nations as well. And I'm excited about that. I came back to Israel with a lot of skills, connections, experience, and I intend to put all these skills and connections into action for the country and the people I love so much.
I from our own personal experience, when you were appointed to this position, there is always a certain level of expectations from politicians who assume diplomatic positions, and you were able to merge the two so well, and it was evident in every aspect of your work. So all I can say, Ambassador, is incredibly well done, and thank you so much for not just for your role, but for joining us and for writing this incredible book.
Thank you, Shahar, and I encourage everybody to order the book on Amazon or in the bookstores and write to me what they think about the book. And I think it's a great tool for anyone who loves and supports Israel. And I want to thank all of you who are also ambassadors for Israel.
You're incredible. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for taking us on this intimate tour of the United Nations. And thank you for your service, many years of service for Israel and the Jewish people. And to you, our viewers, and for anyone with a keen love and interest in Israel and the desire to understand international politics in Israel, I highly recommend reading Ambassador Danon's book. It's available on Amazon and beyond. No matter where we are, no matter what we do, it goes to show us once more that it is always worthwhile to stand up for Israel, and even in the darkest of hallways, Israel's light can shine on. Just be strong with your conviction. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and see you next time as we cast an eye on Israel.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.